It starts, as so many transformative journeys do, in a quiet room chasing shadows on the ceiling. At midnight, bills line up on the kitchen table like silent sentinels, each envelope heavier than the last. You stare at the numbers, trying to make them add up to something that doesn't require an impossible leap. Nights stretch long, sharpened by worry. The hum of the fridge, the tick of the clock, the endless replay of bank statements behind your eyes. You wonder how it got this complicated, how each necessary decision brought you here. This crossroads between what feels like survival and surrender. Across the world and decades away, a man named Andrew Higgins once found himself in that same relentless uncertainty. In the years before his name would ever brush the pages of history, Higgins' world was defined by anxiety that tastes only too familiar. Overwhelming debt, production costs spiraling out of control, contracts never quite materializing, banks growing colder, and the suffocating pressure of payroll days approach. Every payday, he would pace the factory floor, jaw set, trying to quiet the voices telling him he'd gone too far, that this time the doors would close for good. To those on the outside, Andrew was nothing but a stubborn businessman in over his head, the kind that might be pitted in passing but left behind by progress. But to Andrew, and maybe to you too, there was something deeper at stake than dollars and cents. This was about the right to believe in a tomorrow that's not dictated by today's failures. It's about that wild, unspoken hope, the chance that even from piles of debt or the wreckage of past mistakes, something remarkable might emerge. Maybe you know that feeling. Maybe, like Andrew, you stare down the mounting pressure of debts that won't let you breathe. You have ideas, aspirations, maybe even hidden talents, but the world seems to reward only those who already have. The stories you learned growing up about money, worth, and the right way to do things circle in your mind, making every setback feel more permanent than it really is. If you've ever found yourself measuring your future by your overdraft, or letting your heart race at the sound of a collector's call, you are not alone. As rumors of war began to sweep across continents and the world braced for violence, Andrew's desperation felt insurmountable. Then, in a stroke of timing that looked like luck but was truly born of restless invention, a new demand arrived. Boats like no one had seen before, vessels that could carry young men onto hostile shores and change the beating heart of history. Higgins didn't have unlimited capital or certainty, but he did have the capacity to see differently, to glimpse possibility where others saw dead ends. This is not a story about sudden fortune or overnight redemption. It is something braver. It is about the human spirit's fierce insistence on finding light, sometimes flickering, but always there, amid the darkness of financial storms. Andrew Higgins faced moments when quitting would have been easier and maybe even logical. But those moments, the ones that nearly broke him, became the cradle of one of the most revolutionary inventions of the 20th century. If today you sit in your own late-night quiet, feeling the pull toward giving up, know that you're standing at the edge of a paradox. The crucible of distress may birth your greatest clarity, your most creative solutions, and, if you allow it, the beginning of a new story. The journey ahead is a conversation with beliefs inherited and self-made, with habits etched by fear or hope. It asks not for perfection, but for curiosity and courage, a willingness to look at what feels final and wonder, what if there's more? You, like Andrew Higgins, are not just the sum of your liabilities or the limits of your circumstances. You are an unfolding story, perhaps with pages yet unwritten that may surprise you most of all. If you have ever seen scarcity creeping in, if debt has whispered that you cannot, if hope has felt like a stranger, then this journey is for you. Together, we will walk through the tangled roots of financial struggle, pause at crossroads of belief, and set out toward a future shaped not by fear, but by vision. Tonight, beneath the anxious flicker of the kitchen light or the silent weight of an unsent bill, a different chapter can begin. All it asks is that you start where you are, with everything you've brought to this moment. The doubt, the hope, the bruised confidence and stubborn dream that something extraordinary is still possible. The way forward will be revealed one step at a time. Your story, like Andrew's, is far from over. As dawn crept through smudged windows in the Higgins factory office, years before triumph ever brushed his name, a new awareness tiptoed into Andrew's world one morning. a quiet reckoning that unsettled him more than any figurative wolf at the door. The clang of turbines and scent of machine oil were constants, but his mind, on that day, was swirling elsewhere. Clara, his youngest accountant, brushed past him in the hallway, her arms bracketed by reams of paperwork. Their exchange, brief but weighted, lingered with him. Some debts aren't numbers, Mr. Higgins. Sometimes they start at home. For the first time in a long while, he stopped being just a businessman under siege and started asking himself questions that ran far deeper than next month's payroll. Upon retreating to the solitude of his office, Andrew rummaged through the clutter on his desk. In the bottom drawer, wedged between blueprints and a cigar box, he found a faded letter from his father. Years ago, that letter had seemed mundane, a ramble about saving every nickel, fearing anyone who lived above their station, and warnings about the danger of trusting outsiders. Now, Andrew's fingers traced the worn paper, and a dawning suspicion sprouted. Perhaps the words that raised him had not just shaped, but shackled his approach to money. Growing up, the soothing stream of stories over the kitchen table painted success as suspect and risk as ruin. No one discussed possibility, only the cost of failure. Outside his office, the hum of machines and voices continued, but Andrew was elsewhere, picturing himself as a boy, ear pressed to the keyhole, while his parents whispered about bills, scraping by, and the sort of men who worked at banks. That childhood soundtrack lingered, woven so tightly into his thinking, it colored every dollar he touched. When the economy sputtered, memories from long ago, of shoes bought secondhand and heated debates over the price of bread, rose unannounced, steering his choices before logic could intervene. These weren't just recollections, but rules imprinted in the marrow of his decision-making. Meanwhile, Clara, sharp-eyed and soft-spoken, found her own ghosts surfacing. She'd been raised in a family that preached hard work but never talked openly about money. Instead, it was a subject wrapped in secrecy and tension. Her mother's warning, "Never ask for more than you're given," echoed whenever a salary review was mentioned. Sitting beside the white noise of the adding machine, she realized her reluctance to advocate for herself or to envision a life beyond subsistence wasn't mere caution. It was inheritance. Inside both their stories, another current pulsed, culture as a silent architect. In Andrew's neighborhood, the rich were discussed in clipped, suspicious tones. Wealth, it seemed, required moral compromise. During church socials or late-night poker games, neighbors equated money-mindedness with selfishness, as though the mere desire to prosper sullied the soul. This belief forged invisible boundaries around what felt possible. It hemmed in ambition and cast prosperity as a traitorous act. More subtly, the world outside their immediate circle reinforced these lessons. Newspaper headlines warned of financial scandal with a frequency that seemed designed to reinforce every childhood fear. The drama of bankruptcy tales filled the airwaves. Consequently, when opportunity knocked later in life, Andrew and Clara found themselves hesitating, second-guessing investments, shrinking from negotiation, sometimes even sabotaging success for fear that abundance would cost them their character or their community. Unpacking these lessons took honesty. The realization dawns for many, perhaps for you, too, that your instinctive reactions to money aren't random at all, but choreographed long before you ever had a paycheck. If you've caught yourself recoiling at the prospect of abundance or feeling inexplicably nervous about discussing earnings, ask yourself whose voice you hear. Is it your own? Or does it belong to a parent, a teacher, a divorced uncle who lost his savings, or a cultural backdrop that painted wealth in shades of warning? New awareness spills forth when you observe, without judgment, where your earliest feelings about money truly began. Trace the lines back. Was it a family ritual, the scarcity after a job loss, or a communal narrative about knowing your place? These early encodings play out, often unnoticed, as quiet scripts dictating your present-day dance with risk, opportunity, and self-worth. Real transformation starts not by rejecting the past, but by seeing it clearly, daring to ask, what if these old stories aren't facts, but familiar tunes ready to be rewritten? In that modest, oil-swept office, Andrew began to see the difference between inherited caution and lived reality. Just beyond the metallic rattle of industry, a window stood ajar to something freer. A future where the past's fears could be acknowledged, then gently set aside, clearing space for the kind of daring he'd always hungered for but never quite allowed himself to pursue. A sharp gust rattled the factory's bay doors as Andrew stood beneath flickering overhead lights, boot soles grinding against old sawdust and scattered hardware. Tonight, the workshop did not echo with shadows of family warnings or culture's heavy fingerprints. The tension had shifted. Pivoting to the drafting table, he leafed through sketches of bows and hulls, recalling the sharp dismissals of impossible from more established shipbuilders. But where others saw risk, and only risk, Andrew's pulse raced at the improbable challenge. It was here, in this liminal space between skepticism and vision, that he began to confront the collection of assumptions that had long functioned as both armor and prison. He ran his calloused fingers along the edge of a mock-up. "If you really think it can't work, why try at all?" murmured Carl, his lead engineer, setting down a soldering iron and meeting Andrew's gaze. That simple question hovered like a verdict in the dusty air, pushing Andrew toward a precipice few dared acknowledge. Much of his hesitation had not arisen solely from external dogma, but from misbeliefs masquerading as truth inside his own mind. Now, turn your focus inward and notice where certain stories about money and potential quietly nestle. Those internalized headlines that whisper, "Only geniuses get lucky," or "Innovation belongs to someone with better connections, better timing, better luck." What's crucial to recognize is how these myths can wear the costume of common sense, yet subtly erode boldness and delay action. Their persistence colors entire strategies, deciding which risks are measured and which are avoided as futile. Shifting the lens to the break room, you might have heard workers trade tales at lunchtime. One recounting an uncle who mortgaged the house and lost it all on a failed venture, another recalling a neighbor who struck gold and then lost friends to envy. The stories compound, cloaked in details both cautionary and alluring, shaping a folklore where fortune always teeters on the edge of collapse or betrayal. These communal myths often fossilize into dogmatic beliefs. Success always comes at a price. Big wins are for the reckless or the ruthless, or debt is a road with no exit. But the mythos surrounding money, especially its limitations, thrives in silence and repetition. What few ever say aloud is how those who bend history, individuals like Andrew, frequently redraw boundaries by questioning whether these rules were ever true. Pressing on, Andrew could have accepted the broad judgment that a simpler, more affordable landing craft could not outperform legacy designs. Instead, he challenged the entire paradigm, inviting voices around him to imagine not just the possible, but the necessary. As the midnight rain drummed on the roof, Andrew paced, internal monologues swirling. What if the answer isn't in playing it safe? What if playing it safe is the riskiest move of all? That moment marked a subtle fracture in the old narrative. No longer was he simply reacting to crisis. Rather, he forged new affirmations. My value isn't determined by past failures. New problems demand new thinking. Opportunities are made, not given. To embed this philosophy, Andrew built rituals into his days. Each morning before the clatter started, he'd jot one guiding principle on the chalkboard. Every design begins as an impossibility. These concise affirmations, rooted in pragmatism but buoyed by possibility, acted as touchstones against the surge of old doubts. They became shared mantras for his team, spoken aloud as they wrestled blueprints and budgets alike. Moving to your experience, challenge yourself to pluck one myth. Perhaps that prosperity always requires sacrifice of time or values, or that it's too late to start over. What happens if, like Andrew, you rewrite that rule for a week? Instead of, "I can't risk because of my debt," try, "I can experiment safely, even in uncertainty." Let this new narrative, founded on exploration and resilience, inform a small choice, an inquiry, a negotiation, a moment of creative abandon. Despite cynics' warnings, Andrew kept chipping away at rigid ideas about what was possible in business and invention. The change wasn't overnight, nor was it effortlessly maintained. But with every myth dissected, a new opportunity flickered alive. In that old workshop's stubborn light, something bigger than profit was being crafted, a future shaped more by what Andrew dared to believe than by what he'd once been told was inevitable. Beneath the rain-streaked window of the small apartment, a different kind of transformation was quietly brewing. A young woman named Evelyn hunched over a chipped kitchen table, her laptop open to a flickering spreadsheet. The numbers still spiked anxiety up her spine, but lately, she'd been drawn not to their grim summary, but to the small section she'd labeled wins. It was barely a line at first. One credit card paid off, a month of groceries bought with cash, a rare confidence in her tone when negotiating a freelance contract. Instead of glancing away in shame, she let herself feel pride. The world outside, early morning traffic echoing below, pressed in with habitual reminders of scarcity, but she clung stubbornly to each micro-victory. What began as a single column on a spreadsheet shifted the whole atmosphere of her home. Colors seemed a bit brighter in the kitchen. Morning coffee tasted less bitter, tinged with a newfound sense of capability. She didn't realize it at first, but she was actively retraining her nervous system. Each time she acknowledged a win, her brain's anxiety dial receded just enough to allow calm. Not the sweeping relief of a lottery win, but the steady, sustainable quiet of control reclaimed one moment at a time. This wasn't magical thinking, it was biology. Neural connections that once reverberated with stress now lit up differently, reinforcing new pathways of self-trust. Meanwhile, Evelyn started writing each win in a physical journal every Thursday night. This ritual, seemingly small, became a sanctuary from the chaos of unpaid bills and overdue emails. The page filled quickly, client praise, a discount discovered, the courage to ask for payment up front. On days when doubt roared back, those pages shone like guideposts through fog. Her fingers, ink-stained and sure, retraced the evidence that she was adapting, growing into someone who could weather uncertainty. Each journal entry was a morsel of hope, nourishing her ambition and preparing her to risk just a bit more. Alongside this, Evelyn experimented with visualizing the life those wins were slowly building. She'd close her eyes, feeling the morning sun on her face, picturing not only a debt-free future, but the freedom to choose work she loved rather than what merely paid the rent. In her mind's theater, she could see her apartment transform, sunlit, shelves lined with books, plants thriving by open windows. These images weren't empty daydreams, but blueprints. They created a felt sense of possibility, urging her daily actions into alignment with the woman she saw in those moments of quiet certainty. Not everything shifted in linear fashion. Some mornings, defeat pressed in so heavily that even gratitude felt unreachable. In those hours, she turned to action, organizing her workspace, sending one overdue invoice, making a short walk outside. Physical movement broke the spell of stagnation, each small accomplishment providing ballast against the return of old paralysis. With time, she recognized that her habits, not just her thoughts, were seeds of change. A single budget review each Sunday, a recurring calendar reminder for tracking spending. In these actions, she built not just solvency, but self-respect. Bit by bit, Evelyn discovered the interplay between mindset and outcome. A sense of gratitude amplified resolve, making setbacks into stepping stones rather than dead ends. The more she noticed and acknowledged growth, the more resilient she became, willing to ask for help when needed, unafraid to negotiate or decline work that stretched her thin. In this way, her habits served not only practical needs, but emotional resilience. In the mess of ordinary days, Evelyn's story morphed into one of gradual self-mastery. By collecting evidence of progress and deliberately cultivating hope, she wove together a fabric of internal safety and outward action. And though the world still delivered its share of financial curveballs, she met them now with a steady, thoughtful response. A quiet but unmistakable strength that changed not just her fortunes, but her relationship with life's possibilities. The humming city lights poured through the office window, painting shifting patterns across Marcus's makeshift workstation, a battered desk littered with empty coffee cups and crumpled Post-its. For years, Marcus wore his ambition like armor, restless and determined, but beneath the surface, he grappled with a gnawing sense of inadequacy. Every time he had a promotion or set his sights on loftier financial goals, doubts crowded in. The boardroom, for all its glass and gloss, distilled his confidence down to whispers during salary negotiations and silence when higher-ups floated challenging projects. Yet, tonight, his eyes flickered with something unfamiliar, resolve sharpened by the recognition that real power didn't dwell in luck or even timing, but in reshaping his own self-image. He paused, fingertips tracing the grain of the desktop, memories fizzing at the edge of his mind. As a teenager, he'd watched his older cousin, Valerie, stride into any situation with the uncanny ability to command a room. Act as if, she'd always say, her voice bright with unshakable certainty. Back then, it sounded like bravado, but Marcus now saw the wisdom behind the act. Identity, he understood in that instant, is crafted, not merely accepted or inherited. The stories we choose to tell about who we are become self-fulfilling, quietly reinforcing every action, reaction, and expectation we bring into the world. Emerging from this revelation, Marcus took a deliberate step. The following week, he carved out 2 hours each day for skill building, enrolling in a public speaking course that forced him well beyond his comfort zone. The anxiety that rose with each class reminded him he was stepping into a threshold, not away from fear, but through it. In every stammer and misstep, he anchored the experience to his vision of himself not as a struggling employee, but as someone naturally sought after for insight and value. Role-playing negotiations and pitching ideas, he glimpsed his new identity, the leader, the strategist, the financially savvy professional who navigated uncertainty with calm authority. In tandem, Marcus began aligning his small, everyday choices with his larger sense of mission. Instead of defaulting to conveniently cheap, low-quality purchases, he set standards for every transaction, insisting that his spending habits reflect the care he wanted to bring to every facet of his life. He no longer saw frugality as deprivation, but as a conscious act of stewardship. Whether declining flashy trends or scrutinizing monthly subscriptions, each decision was a muscle-tested commitment to viewing himself as someone who provided value not just for his employer, but also for himself and those he cared for. Conversely, Marcus took ownership of his moral compass in financial contexts. After witnessing colleagues cut corners for short-term gains, he recommitted quietly to a code. Abundance, for him, must serve something greater, not just his personal comfort, but community, responsibility, and long-term integrity. He volunteered to lead a pro bono consulting project for a local nonprofit, lending his growing expertise to causes that aligned with his reborn sense of purpose. This wasn't about optics or external validation. The work resonated on a deeper level, reinforcing the narrative that his ability to create wealth and manage it well could exist in harmony with empathy and positive impact. As he navigated this transformed self-understanding, Marcus noticed that others began to respond to him differently. Doors that once seemed bolted slid open. Colleagues listened more attentively, supervisors extended trust, and opportunities surfaced that once seemed reserved for an unattainable class of insiders. The echo chamber of past doubt quieted, replaced by the rhythm of a new, more deliberate confidence. His bank account followed suit, reflecting habits honed by clarity and self-respect. Standing in his kitchen late one evening, Marcus reflected on the shift. The journey had not been a meteoric rise, but a series of small recalibrations, each one forging and reinforcing a self-concept of strength, vision, and purpose. He understood now, as he measured out coffee for the next morning, that every financial breakthrough was, at its core, an act of identity. And within that identity lived endless room to grow, lead, and prosper with integrity. The night air, thick with the scent of wet pavement, crept in through the cracked window of a quiet apartment. Inside, Mariah hunched over a stack of papers, cheeks flushed with both determination and uncertainty. The old kitchen clock ticked with stubborn regularity, an anchor against the whirlwind of change swirling through her life. Just 3 weeks ago, she might have shrugged off another late fee or ignored the unopened envelope resting on the counter. These days, though, each choice pulsed with new significance, rippling through her thoughts with the steady momentum of someone learning to trust themselves in unfamiliar territory. A journal, its pages still mostly unmarked, sat open beside her. She glanced at the blankness and then, with a sigh, uncapped her pen. The first line she wrote was not a list of debts or a grim tally of what was owed. Instead, She wrote the names of 3 people she admired for their resourcefulness, not for their riches, but for how they navigated setbacks. There was an aunt who had once traded the family's old minivan for a neighbor's makeshift art lessons, planting the seeds for a lifelong hobby. The high school friend who had started a landscaping business with borrowed tools, quietly paying back every penny well before his 25th birthday. Each memory sharpened her attention, coaxing her to examine not just numbers, but the hidden resources embedded in her daily life. Her phone buzzed, shattering the silence. As she glanced at the screen, an offer to join a bartering app flashed across her notifications. An idea sparked. What if money wasn't always the solution, but rather a tool among many? She signed up, trading 3 hours of tutoring for a week's worth of fresh groceries. The exchange didn't eliminate her debts overnight, but it kindled a rare sense of agency, a recognition that, sometimes, value is more than what appears on a statement. Gradually, possibilities expanded like concentric circles. Mariah took inventory of the skills and connections she'd previously ignored. The ability to fix small appliances, her knack for organizing cluttered spaces, even her homemade bread that always vanished first at neighborhood gatherings. She texted a few neighbors, offering her help in exchange for dog walking or spare produce from their gardens. Each small agreement braided her more tightly into her community, transforming what had once felt isolating into a network pulsing with mutual aid. Yet, not every attempt flourished. Occasionally, a message would go unanswered, an offer rejected, or a swap falling short of expectations. In those moments, frustration pricked her resolve, but she pressed forward, mindful of the growing balance between resilience and resourcefulness. Instead of surrendering to inertia, she found herself recalibrating on the fly. If a plan crumbled, she pivoted, enlisting advice, reaching out in new directions, sometimes sitting quietly with the discomfort until the next idea surfaced. Each recalibration became another thread in her tapestry of self-reliance. These accumulated experiences filtered into her daily routines. At work, she volunteered to pilot a staff recycling initiative. Though no one had asked, she recognized that the office wasted costly supplies and that organizing a new system could save money for everyone. Management, initially skeptical, gradually came around after Mariah documented the savings and involved colleagues who had never spoken up before. The project drew together coworkers from opposite ends of the pay scale, sparking conversations that had never happened outside budget discussions. For Mariah, this was more than a clever idea. It was evidence that shifting mindset through intentional, collective action could ripple outward, affecting dynamics far beyond her immediate needs. By week's end, on the walk home past rows of swaying city trees, Mariah let herself breathe in the difference. Her bank balance might not have grown much, but her life had become full in ways she'd never anticipated. Fuller in connection, in creativity, in quiet pride. She looked at her reflection in passing shop windows, shoulders straighter, gaze steadier, and knew these were not the changes tracked by interest rates or credit scores. These were the markers of someone who, bit by bit, was reimagining possibility, not just for herself, but for everyone touched by her new ways of seeing. Reflecting on this journey so far, you may sense a subtle shift coursing quietly beneath the surface, a current gathering force, not through any single revelation, but as a gradual, unmistakable convergence. Like the final moments before dawn, when night's uncertainty gives way to a diffused, patient light, the layers of change now press gently against preconceptions, leaving behind the chill of old anxieties and inviting in the warmth of something new. In this in-between, you find yourself at the threshold, eyes adjusting, heart quickening, spirit alert to the resonance of lessons you have lived, rather than simply heard. Imagine, for a moment, a sprawling mosaic, each tile shaped by the conflicts, discoveries, and subtle victories that have colored the canvas of your financial life. At first glance, the design appears fragmented and chaotic, a clash of colors, sharp angles, and uneven edges. Yet as you step back, perspective expands and borders begin to soften. What once felt discordant now hints at intricate symmetry. There are lines of strength running through the whole, lines you could only trace after walking the labyrinth of your own experience. Here, buried within this intricate puzzle, you catch sight of quiet harmonies, depths and patterns only visible with distance and patience. It's as if you're standing at a crossroads, not of roads, but of stories, those told to you, those you once accepted unquestioningly, and those you have begun to write for yourself. The old narratives still echo faintly, but they mingle now with new patterns of thought and intention. You can sense how actions and beliefs pulse alongside one another, neither dominating entirely, but weaving together in a rhythm both familiar and refreshingly different. If you listen closely, if you allow yourself to lean into the tension rather than shrink away, there's a dawning realization that change is not a distant summit to be scaled all at once, but a path that reveals itself through movement and curiosity. The air carries a new electricity, reminiscent of the hush just before the first notes of an overture. In this pause, you recognize the subtle yet profound recalibration that has taken root. How discomfort, once avoided at all costs, now signals possibility, a signal that you are crossing into less charted territory. Moments that once felt like failures are, in hindsight, the compost from which resilience emerges, rich, layered, and essential for new growth. Each habit practiced, each idea tested, each risk taken in faith rather than fear, shapes an undulating terrain under your feet, no longer a patchwork of crises, but an evolving landscape marked by agency and authentic self-regard. As you look ahead, something within calls for greater clarity and fidelity to your own evolving sense of self. There is a gravity that draws the disparate elements of your history toward coherence, a magnetic pull that smooths sharp angles into gentle curves, forging a continuity you may not have thought possible when you began. The prism of your life refracts light in new directions now, scattering insight and possibility across paths you once thought impassable. You are no longer merely reacting to circumstance. You are learning to respond with intention. In this liminal space, both the uncertainty and the promise feel heightened. It's a precarious balance, like the hush in a theater, just as the lights dim and the curtains lift, when everyone draws a collective breath in anticipation. What will follow is unwritten, but this much is certain. The sum of everything thus far has prepared you, not for guarantees, but for the wisdom to keep moving, keep shaping, keep believing that the story is, in fact, yours to author. The world outside remains unchanged for now. Its traffic, its routines, its restless tempo. Inside, though, you are a step closer to the realization that neither hardship nor hope exists in isolation. They are threads tightly woven, bound to each other in service of something larger than comfort or certainty. The journey does not culminate in the avoidance of pain or the mere accumulation of things. Rather, it is a slow unfurling, a gathering of courage to stand more vividly in your own life, ready for the next movement. A conclusion that promises not an end, but the invitation to embrace your own unfolding abundance, step by measured step. Rain misted against the windows as dawn began to stir, tracing silver rivulets down the glass. In that soft hour, Andrew stood by the factory entrance, the once echoing halls of defeat now vibrating with quiet intent. The machines, lined sleek and ready, no longer felt like a chorus of demands, but like silent partners in a story still unfolding. With one hand pressed to the cool steel of the doorframe, Andrew let himself linger, heart pulsing not with anxiety, but with a hesitant hope, an unfamiliar feeling that perhaps, after everything, the tide had begun to turn. He remembered sleepless nights heavy with despair, the weight of bills like anchors tied to every future plan. Yet as he watched the first shift workers drift in, jackets slung across slumped shoulders, he saw in them a reflection of his own long battle, the invisible fight to believe, again and again, that renewal was possible. Their laughter, rough-edged and real, bounced off concrete floors, a reminder that it's our connections, to others and to the work itself, that tether us when we lose sight of the shore. Andrew's gaze caught on Clara, standing apart just as he'd so often done, clutching a clipboard brimming with numbers. He walked over, offering a gentle smile. "Funny," he said quietly, "how a single idea, born out of near failure, can open doors for everyone. How suddenly, what we built for survival could bridge us to something larger." Clara's eyes widened, not just in acknowledgement of what he'd achieved, but in solidarity, a recognition of the shared foundation beneath their separate journeys. Both, in their own way, had endured the quiet tyranny of doubt, the inherited limits of their upbringing, the stubborn myths that had once told them to settle. Now, as wind curled through the factory nooks and sunlight nudged past the storm, a different narrative shimmered on the horizon. It was not the blinding rush of victory, nor the simple closing of accounts. It was the slow, hard-won realization that every step out of scarcity was a testament to the courage it takes to stay open, to risk again when the world offers no guarantees. Andrew knew, as did those who worked beside him, that transformation rarely arrives with trumpets or fanfare. It emerges subtly, in increments, a new habit, a changed conversation, a moment of self-advocacy that only yesterday seemed out of reach. In the space between the machinery's quiet hum and the day's unfolding, the factory was no longer just a place of production, but a crucible for possibility. The air vibrated with stories of death survived, doors reopened, and faith restored not by luck, but by the steady work of believing, failing, and believing again. As the clock's hands circled, Andrew drew a breath deeper than he had in years, the metal tang of hope filling his lungs. He understood now that abundance isn't a fortune stumbled upon, but a discipline, a devotion to growth, reinvention, and making meaning from struggle. Outside, the city was waking, car horns blending with birdsong, sunlight breaking through solemn clouds. Within that cacophony, Clara tucked her clipboard under her arm, her stride newly confident. Side by side, she and Andrew walked the long corridor, their footsteps echoing a lesson that would outlast them both, that every limitation, every doubt and debt and failure is a doorway, if only we dare to push through. The journey is never merely about money, but about reclaiming the story we tell ourselves, and in doing so, unlocking abundance far richer than any ledger could ever hold. If you find yourself standing where Andrew once stood, may you remember, uncertainty is not your ending. It is the fertile soil of your next beginning. The future, as wide and unmarked as morning, waits for the story only you can tell.